Now it's my pleasure to introduce Jerry Nicklesburg back to our forum here. He's with the UCLA Anderson forecast. It's the most widely followed forecast in the state about the state economy. Dr. Nicklesburg is a regular presenter around the country, and he's been cited in the national and local media such as the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and our locally owned Press Democrat. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Minnesota. Jerry has really grown to love coming up to the wine country in Sonoma County and spends usually a good part of a week here because it's such a change of his life from the lifestyle on the beaches of Malibu. So please join me in a warm welcome for Jerry.
Thank you, Ben. And it is true. It's a change from the beaches of Malibu, and I always enjoy coming up here to Sonoma County. And it's particularly a pleasure to come up here and have this conversation with you today, because when I started doing this a few years ago, we were going down into the recession. So things look much brighter today, as Supervisor Rabbit has told you and as Ben has told you in his slides. What I want to do is I want to go through what's happening in the U.S. and what we can expect in 2013 as we go through this year, and what that means, and then California, and then I want to make some comments about what's happening here in Sonoma County. So the kind of the roadmap is I want to start out by talking about my forecasts, and then the U.S. muddling through with this slow growth, monitoring fiscal policy, what the federal government can do, what it is doing, then California, and then Sonoma. So let's start here. Now, one of the luxuries, but I think it's an unfortunate luxury of being a forecaster, is we're always looking forward. We're always saying, here's what's going to happen next, and we're not really taking the time to look backwards and say, well, here's what I said was going to happen and what did actually happen. So I'm going to kind of take a bit of a risk here. I guess I need to put these three up and look backwards. So these are the forecasts that I've made for employment growth in California that I've shared with you over the last 4 years. And the red line is the actual. So the actual has a lot more variation in it, which is what you would expect. The green line is what's called four-step ahead forecast. So that is what we thought would happen 1 year prior. And if you look, the green line actually does pretty well against the red line. The blue is what we thought would happen 1 quarter later. And the blue line also does fairly well, but I want you to look at kind of the last 4 quarters. I'm a little bit low on that blue line, and I want you to remember that. It's not a statistically significant difference, but I want you to remember that. We're going to come back to that. So that's the forecast performance. Now let's turn to the U.S. This is GDP, which is the total sum of goods and services produced in the economy. The vertical line there is the end of the actuals, and the forecast is to the right. And you can clearly see the 2008-2009 recession. Then we come out of it. There are a couple of times when GDP growth hits 4%. Mostly it's about 2%. Now, recent experience, meaning since World War II, coming out of a recession, particularly a deep recession, meant GDP growth in the 5 to 7% range. We've been doing much less than that. We've had this subpar growth, and the factors that have led us to that, which I want to talk about momentarily, lead us to this forecast looking forward, that this year is in fact going to be a year of even slower growth, 2013, and we get into 2014, then we start growing and kind of moving up towards 3%, still not at that 5 to 7% level. And what that means nationally is that unemployment is going to still hover in that 7.7 to 8% range that it's been in for a number of months. Now, California's unemployment rate has been coming down, but the U.S. hasn't. It's kind of stuck there because of the slow national growth, and then gradually coming down. So the slow growth means slow improvement in the economy. Improvement, but slow improvement. And If you look at it in terms of job growth, this is sort of pretty dramatic, the drop in the 2008 recession. And all the way out to the end of our forecast period, we finally get back to where we were in 2007. That's the end of 2014. So that's a 7-year time span. And so that's the second thing that I'm going to ask you to remember is that 7 years. Because that 7 years is kind of significant. It's going to relate to some of the historical things we're going to look at. But when we get there at the end of 2014, that's still not good enough because we have 7 years of population growth, 7 years of labor force growth, 7 years of job growth that we need to make up. Okay, so let's turn to what's going on. This GDP, this goods and services that we produce, it goes into 4 places. Either households buy it, and that's called consumption, and that's 70% of it, or it goes to foreigners, or the government, or investors. That's 30% of it. This is 70% right here, and consumption growth is sitting at about a 2% growth rate. And normally coming out of a recession is much, much higher. Why is it at a 2% growth rate? Well, today households are not thinking that they're going to augment their savings and have for the future significant equity in their homes. That instead, we need to save out of income. And so all households in America are trying to push up their savings rates in order to provide those resources for the future. Now, that's not a bad thing, but when people are trying to push up their savings rates, they're pushing down their consumption, which means they're pushing down demand for goods and services. And if that's 70% of GDP, and that's being pushed down, the other 30% is going to have to pick up the slack and is going to have to grow at double-digit rates if you're going to get those 5 to 7%. I mean, that's just kind of accounting that if 70% does that, that's where you're at. Looking forward, we see households still trying to push down debt, increase savings, and not increase consumption. Consumers are still pretty frugal in the U.S., even though there's been a lot of job growth. So let's look at that other 30%. Housing has been kind of in the tank for a long time. We're going to look at California housing momentarily, but we're starting to get growth. We're up to right now about 950,000 units. So this is new residential construction. On our way to our average of 1.5 million, but it's going to take a couple of years still to get there because many of the places where we build a lot of houses still have considerable overhang, and all you have to do is drive through the Central Valley or Inland Empire, and you see a lot of evidence of that. Exports, so this is to foreigners, that was doing pretty well, but now Europe, which takes 20% of U.S. exports, is in a recession. Even Germany has started contracting. This is a sort of long-running recession. Every quarter you see economists say, okay, now it's going to be over with and Europe's going to grow, and every quarter it turns negative. So we're not sure when they're going to come out of this recession, but certainly that puts a damper on our sales to foreigners. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, still growing, but at a much slower rate. And Japan in recession, so we can't really rely on exports to lead us to much faster growth. It's contributing, it's a good thing, but it's not leading us to much faster growth. Investment outside of housing in equipment and software, and this is the automation that we're seeing, the technological change that we're seeing, and business investment in equipment and software still strong. That's really beneficial to us here in California. Investment in business structures. It looked like it was strong in 2012, and in fact it was. But when you take out of that drilling rigs for natural gas, which have now gone to zero because natural gas prices are low, we didn't have much in the way of new non-residential building. And we're not expecting much this year. But as the economy really starts growing, we're going to see more industrial buildings, we're going to see more office buildings, as we go into 2014 and 2015. So when you add all of that up, that 30% that we just went through, the only thing we didn't cover was government, because I didn't think we needed a slide to tell us that government's contracting. State, local, and federal government are contracting. So if you add that up, that 30% is not doing the double-digit growth rate. So it's no surprise we have 2% growth. And it's no surprise we're going to have 2% or less growth in 2013, particularly because we've just had tax increases. And so we've got an adjustment process that's going on. We still have uncertainty about the fiscal cliff. The fiscal cliff was changed from 1 fiscal cliff to 2 fiscal cliffs. Might end up as 3, but we haven't solved all of this. And so we've got tax increases now, and we've got uncertainty about what's going to happen with spending. So we're seeing even slightly slower in 2013. But after the adjustment to that new reality happens, then we start growing a little bit faster. So what can government policy do? What you see here are interest rates driven by monetary policy. So the Federal Reserve has driven, right away, drove interest rates down to 0 to try and induce investment, making investment more attractive. They've been there for a long time. They're promised to be there for a long time. And the Fed has provided ample liquidity. And the way that monetary policy works is that you drive down interest rates. That makes investments more attractive. You make money available for borrowing. That makes it easier to make those investments. And you get an increase in that demand. Well, we've had that for a long time. And the Fed is really just kind of pushing on a string. Nothing is really happening with that. And since nothing's happening with it and Fed policy isn't changing, it would be unreasonable to expect anything to happen with it in the future. And so the Federal Reserve is kind of on the sideline. But there is sort of an issue hanging out there that we all need to be aware of and think about. What you see here is basically the Fed's balance sheet. Kind of goes along in a nice, smooth way, right through the shaded areas, which are recessions. You get to September 2008, and whoa, something big happens there. We have the financial crash. The Fed doubles its balance sheet. But that wasn't good enough. In order to keep these interest rates at 0, they kept pumping money into the system. And when they had pumped enough, they came up with QE and QE2 and sequel to QE and teenage bride of QE. And they keep going on with pumping money into the system. They have now more than tripled their balance sheet. And the Fed's policy is to go to at least quadrupling the balance sheet. Well, that's fine, the Fed says, because interest rates are, the inflation rate is pretty low. It's 2% or less. So we don't have any real inflationary pressures from all this money that's in the system. And so far they're right. But if you're going to take that kind of liquidity, if you're going to reduce your balance sheet by 75% and not have something big happen, you've got to do it slowly in a measured way over time. You have to start it early. Otherwise, you are either going to do what happened when Paul Volcker came in to the Federal Reserve, which was take a lot of liquidity out of the system. Now, he did it in order to quash inflation, but you get a recession out of that, or you're going to get inflation. And the Fed says, look, it looks like that. We can walk this tightrope. We can take that liquidity out of the system. No one's ever done anything like this before, but we know what we're doing. So we all hope they do. But it's something that we need to watch after 2014. So as we get to mid to late decade, this is a real potential for a problem coming up. In terms of fiscal policy, we have these large deficits. The discussion in Washington isn't about a new stimulus package, except when Paul Krugman talks. Everyone else is talking about fiscal restraint, cutting deficits, and that's what the sequestration is about. And so fiscal policy is kind of on the sidelines too. So this economy of ours that's growing at a 2% rate is really going to have to kind of work itself out without federal government policy inducing faster growth. Let me just put all of these up here. But now, so now's when you have to remember that 7-year period. These episodes of slow growth, they're not uncommon. We look and you know, kind of most of the commentators talk about post-World War II, but that's only because post-World War II we have really good data. In fact, these episodes, if you look through history, and I've got a couple of them up there, are really quite common. So we have, after the Civil War, a lot of disruption, then we had a lot of growth with infrastructure construction. Construction was the largest single employer in the US. We hit 1873, and we're done with that. We have a deep recession, a period of adjustment, 7 years of slow growth until 1780. We had the Gilded Age, new metallurgy, the mechanization of the factory, rapid economic growth, imbalances were created. 1893, we get a big recession, about 7 years of slow growth and recovery. In the 1920s to the 1940s, we lost 12% of all jobs in the US. They were on the farm in the US in that period of time. We had a recession in 1929, 1930. It was about 7.5, 8 years when we got to 1937 when we were back to where we were before. So for some reason, it's not a, you know, it's not a scientific law, but it seems to take about 7 years, more or less. And that's what we're in the process of now. And kind of the good news is we're getting closer and closer to the end of this. And what is really happening today, and I think you heard it in the supervisor's talk, and in past years you've heard it from other supervisors and the initiatives that are going on here in Sonoma County, is we're transforming from an industrial economy to an information economy. Technology is key, education of the workforce is key, and that's what really kind of takes that 7-year period, 7, 8 years. That's the process that we're in. And so while we see this slow growth, and maybe it's a little frustrating, it is kind of a natural process to get to actually what ends up being a time when incomes are higher and there's a lot more wealth and we have a lot more rapid growth. Just kind of inherent in the capitalist system. And what are going to be the growth sectors in the information age? Education, information, professional, scientific, and technical services, advanced manufacturing, and we're going to come back to this list, but it also includes, because we're going to be have higher incomes and wealthier, healthcare, leisure and hospitality, and personal care services. So that's where we're expecting to see the growth, not in traditional manufacturing, not in, but in advanced manufacturing, not in construction. Those are going to be slower growing areas. So the U.S. forecasts, slow to no growth in the coming quarters, but then picking up till we get more normal growth by mid-2014. We will most likely avoid another contraction. The downside risk, we don't know what's going to happen with Europe. And kind of anyone who says they do, I think, is just making it up. So Europe is a big wild card. And a second is that, that we will have serious fiscal constraints. So that was a concern with the fiscal cliff, which was taking $600 billion of demand out of the US economy. We could face that again, and so that's another risk to this forecast. So let's turn to California. The last time I was here, I talked about California in terms of the two Californias, not being us on the beaches in Malibu and you all up here in beautiful Sonoma County, but an east-west divide. And to the west is a vibrant economy. It is in the information age, it's technology, it's trade, it's knowledge communities. And to the east of that red line, an economy based on migration, construction, and growth in government. And those are two very different Californias. And I want to continue to talk a bit about that. But if you look at the red line, this is the one I drew last year. And and at least for part of it, I got it to go along the San Andreas Fault. And apparently that did something because the lines shifted. Now, I didn't read about such an earthquake, but apparently it happened. And the line no longer goes right through Sonoma County, but goes to the east of Sonoma County. Some really interesting things have been happening here that have been, and they've been happening for a while. And at this conference and elsewhere, you've heard about that. But during this past year, we've actually seen the tangible evidence of that kind of movement from being 1 foot into the inland style economy and 1 foot into the coastal economy to really being more like the coastal economy, which is good news because the inland economies are still mired in slow growth, overhang of housing, too many people looking for work in construction and in some of the traditional manufacturing, and trying to adjust to the new economy, and have much longer ways to go. But let's look at California for a moment and then come back to Sonoma County. This is employment in California. We lost 1.36 million jobs in the recession. We've gained 550,000 back. And so we're a little less than halfway back. But California continues to grow. And just to give you a comparison, these are growth rates of employment by state in the blue. The one that's in the UCLA blue and gold, that's California. All the way over the left is North Dakota. North Dakota is just off the charts. It has abundant energy resources and almost no people. And so you get a very fast growth rate. California is number 10 in this. It's been moving around, but since January of 2010, California's been in the top 10. Sometimes 1, sometimes 2, sometimes 5. The numbers change month to month, and this last data puts us at number 10 in the top 10, but still one of the fastest growing states in the US. And in terms of sectors, it is it's pretty widespread. The red over there is continued job loss. This is year-to-date 2012, and it's in manufacturing. And again, that's not advanced manufacturing. That's not the new way manufacturing is being done, but it's in some of the older manufacturing, and it's in government. And that's really the only places we're losing jobs. In construction, we've started adding jobs in leisure and hospitality, in agriculture, in professional and business services, sort of all across the spectrum. We have widespread growth in jobs in California, and it's also happening geographically. The red here is the US. The only thing to the right of the red, slower growing, but now finally positive, it has been negative for a while, is the San Joaquin Valley and the Inland Empire. So you remember I said the inland parts of the state still struggling, and you can see it here growing slower than a very anemic US growth rate. But on the left, so you have the mid-coast, and you have the Bay Area, and the Bay Area has been, so the Bay, by the Bay Area, these are, this is the San Francisco MSA and the San Jose MSA, so it doesn't include the North Bay Area. But since January 2010, the Bay Area has been leading the US with 2 to 3 times the rate of growth in jobs. And again, the coastal counties adding jobs. Which brings us to our housing market. And so I found this kind of interesting. What you see on here, the blue line, is new permits for single-family homes, which is a real driver of growth in California between 2001 and 2007. And from nearly 8,000, it drops down to around 2,000. And it just kind of sits there at 2,000. And more recently, it's moved up a little bit. And that may be a trend, but it's not, certainly not enough data to predict a trend. So it's sitting here at about a quarter of its peak. The red line is multifamily housing. And the multifamily housing dropped also to a quarter of its peak, but it's now back up to 75% of its peak. That's where all the action is in the housing market, is multifamily housing. Rents are going up, vacancy rates are going down, and we're seeing lots of new projects in multifamily housing. And of course, those projects are where we have job growth along the coast. So you're seeing it in Los Angeles, in Orange County, in San Francisco, and we've got new construction projects that are hiring construction workers. The unfortunate thing is that most of our construction workers who are unemployed are a good bit east of there. And what happened there? A good bit east of there and east of that red line. So just to kind of round out what's happening in housing, this is home sales. And if you look at it kind of from this perspective, going back a few years, even though you might pick up what you would call a trend from 2011, and that's what you'll read in the press, there's no trend here. Yeah. It was only that 2011 was really bad, but so was 2010 and 2009, and we don't look a lot different from that. So in terms of home sales, we're still not making a lot of progress, and that's what's going to be important in really revitalizing the housing market. Now we're getting some increase in home prices. Some of this is just because of the mix of homes that's being sold, but some of it is actual appreciation in home prices. So that's good news. We're getting some of the market cleared off. But this, I think, is the important thing to realize in talking about California housing markets. The red line is foreclosures, and it makes headlines. Foreclosures are down in California. They're dropping like a rock. Well, yeah, because banks have found out that it is a lot less expensive to convince somebody to do a short sale than to take them through foreclosure. You get rid of the home and your bad loan quicker, and you spend a lot less money on it. So much so that banks are now offering sometimes up to $30,000 to a homeowner who will get their home sold to help them move. And if you look at the top line, the blue line, that is total distressed, and the difference between the two are short sales. It's coming down, but not quite as rapidly. And what that means is that 43% of all homes in California being sold are still distressed sales. And that kind of market is not a market that's going to engender a lot of building of single-family homes. And that's really the explanation for that flat blue line that we saw a moment ago. But we do see local market improvement, and I'm sure you're starting to see it here, although I haven't looked at the data, because job growth helps. I mean, with job growth, so the kids have a job, they have an income, and time to move out. I don't want to live with mom and dad, and they look for a place to live. That's part of that multifamily demand. Also, we see foreign sales. The world is kind of a dangerous place, and where are you going to put your money? Well, you could put it in U.S. Treasuries. We saw those interest rates a few slides ago. With inflation rate at 2%, you're paying the U.S. government to hold your money for you, because that's sort of the best thing going. Or you could buy California real estate. And we're seeing a lot of foreign purchasers of California real estate thinking that seems to be a pretty good place to put your money. And so we've got multifamily housing recovering. Non-residential is actually poised for new growth with this increase in manufacturing, increase in office using employment. The demand pressures are beginning to build in the non-residential space for new industrial and office buildings. So we've got the preliminary statistical evidence that we've actually finally turned the corner, but there's still a ways to go, particularly in single-family housing. So that brings us to our forecast for California. Slower growth in 2013, but this is actually slightly more rapid than the U.S. So we've got a year that's not going to be too exciting. But after that, we start growing faster, and California will continue to grow faster than the U.S. It's going to push our state's unemployment rate down to where it's actually pretty close to the U.S. at the end of 2014, down in the 7s. Now, part of that is that the U.S. rate doesn't decline very much, and part of it is that California continues to make inroads. So with that, what I want to do is turn to some data on Sonoma County. So this chart is going to show you cumulative job loss from October of 2007. And the first line is going to be construction. And so this hasn't been adjusted for seasonality. But what you see is construction declines with the recession, kind of goes up and down with the seasons, but it's sort of been flat since then. Not increasing, not decreasing. And if you add to that, this is cumulative. So this is adding to the construction job loss in government. And you can see there's a lag there, as there always is, of about a year in government. And then the two kind of widen. And the difference between the two is cumulative job loss in government. And again, that kind of bounces around. There's seasonal. There's the, particularly with school employees. But the difference between the two doesn't change a lot. Okay? So down and kind of flat, construction and government. Now let's look at everything else. What you see the recession there, that when you hit September 2008, this thing really drops like a rock. And then it keeps dropping slowly till you hit the bottom. But then it starts coming up. And it basically squeezes out most of the area between the red line and the green line. That in Sonoma County, almost all of the recession is over with. So you remember the 7 years to when you got back to the same number of jobs. Well, here in Sonoma County, except for construction and government, you're about there. And there's still a ways to go because there's still construction and government job loss, and that's why the unemployment rate is where it is. But again, think about it, where the unemployment rate was relative to the U.S., and today it's below the U.S. unemployment rate. California has the third highest unemployment rate in the country. Sonoma County's unemployment rate is below the U.S. So enormous progress has been made here, and you can see it in this next graphic, which is what I'll finish up with. The green there, so on the left-hand side, that was the employment gain by region in California compared to the U.S. in red. The green is Sonoma County. So you all are outperforming everywhere else in the state, and I haven't looked at everywhere in the U.S., but clearly most everywhere in the U.S. Because on the right is the U.S. chart. You remember with the rate of growth by state, and of course our California in UCLA, Bruin, and gold. Well, Sonoma is in green. It's off the charts. You all are up there with North Dakota, but they're actually people who live here. And so the news is really good. But what's been happening, and what you heard in the previous presentations, is this shift to the information economy with the workforce development, with the initiatives that are going on. The growth in jobs here, if you look at it kind of by sector, you remember those growth sectors that I listed? That's what's growing here in Sonoma, and that's what's creating this good news. And because that's growing, even though the U.S. is going to slow, so you're going to expect slower growth in Sonoma as well in the next year, we still expect it to be much more rapid than the U.S. and continued progress to be made. And now I want to come back to that first chart that I showed of my forecast performance. And you remember the blue line was a little bit below actuals. So I'm going to hold you all responsible for that because I didn't predict these really amazing growth rates in employment. And if I had known that Sonoma was going to grow at that rate, I would have been right on with my forecast. Thank you.
This concludes today's session. Thank you very much for being here. When you come back next year, Jerry will be doing even better. Thank you.